I'm so delighted here with my first visit to Baylor. I flew in and green everywhere, and I realized that green is not your usual color in the summer. So it has been green since I've been here. You have an absolute treasure in that wonderful, wonderful building that houses all those glass windows. If you students don't know about it yet, you should go over there. It's a national treasure. Your campus is wonderful. I've met a number of the students, some of whom are here. I'm visiting also with my dear friend of old times, Robert Roberts of the philosophy department, and I'm getting to know those of you who teach here. And I really, really appreciate the warm and wonderful hospitality you've shown. And to the Northcutts, my thanks for joining such a prestigious list of people who offer words about music and our life. In a world filled with suffering and terror, yet so full of beauty, music has a capacity, I wish to propose, to explore the permanent tensions between religious faith, artistic expression, and what it means to be human, the question we all have. I speak here of permanent tensions because in this world, in our world of space, time, and history, these matters are constantly contested, or at least contesting with one another. Of course faith and music belong together, of course. They support one another. And of course faith is a way of understanding what it is to be human before God. Yet the tensions appear when what? When suffering and terror are our lot. And when they come to confront us and to challenge our notions of what is beautiful, what is humane, much less what is the role of art, and particularly for us here, the role of music in our life. So in what follows today, I wish simply to focus on the paradoxes and the ongoing reality of how music comes to terms with human extremities. There's so much more to say, but that's the focal point. How does music come to terms with human extremity? And what are the questions music can put to faith, and music can put to those who would destroy the world with malevolence, violence, and let's face it, sheer forgetfulness of what it is to be human. Let me start out abstractly so that you won't fall asleep later. You're still alive, I see your lively faces. So I'm going to offer this is for the students, this is heavyweight metaphysical stuff. 4 proposals, okay? And then what I'm going to do is draw these proposals as though they were strands of a weaving through examples. Benjamin Britten, Mahler, perhaps a touch of Messiaen, we'll see how that goes. And then something more close to you, perhaps to many of us, 2 hymn texts. One by Brian Wren and the other by Sylvia Dunstan. Okay? That's our covenant. Baptists should be used to covenant language. So the 4 theses then. 4 things to think about, but I want you also to think with these things. 1, music is intimately related to the narrative quality of our human existence, human experience. The narrative quality, living through time, accumulating time, engaging and presenting us with the feel of our temporal experience in symbolic form, but always sensually and bodily perceived. That's heavy enough, isn't it? So music is related to the narrative quality of our experience, but always mediated through the musical structures, bodily, sensually perceived. Another way to put this is that there are emotions, and music is related to emotions, but musical emotions are related in very powerful and complex ways to the emotions we experience in living through time. Second thesis. When poetic texts, when words that sing, are fused with musical language, music adds to the linguistically expressible, that is to say the words, the dimension of the inexpressible. Or another way to put this in really fancy language is, music can hold together that which is cataphatic according to the images, and apophatic. It takes the images away and plunges us onto the edge of silence. Third, music does, some music, not all perhaps, but music does have the capacity to deepen human understanding of the extremities of the life of our life, as well as everydayness. And music does this characteristically by accumulating layers of human awareness. Shall we say above cognitivity, above cognitive reason, or below? Let us say both. We can talk about that later, all right? Are you with me so far? No one has fallen asleep yet? All right. Fourth, and this moves us explicitly in the direction of the theological theme I want to sound before we're through. Music in ritual contexts. And here, by ritual, I do not mean to oppose smells and bells to plain Mennonites and Quakers. Music in ritual contexts where human beings gather to hear and to respond and to give expression to deep things before God and one another. Music in ritual context becomes something like an eschatological art. It anticipates that which eyes have not seen, nor ears heard. Is this enough for one afternoon? All right, let's start with the cases. And with music, it is always a matter of giving ourselves to this sonata, to this lied, to this hymn, to that old song that keeps echoing back and bringing back so much of the memories of another time and another place. Oh dear, they're playing our song. Some of you know that expression. So let's do the cases. First, Britain. And where else to begin but the War Requiem? I'm curious, how many of you are acquainted with Benjamin Britten's War Requiem? Okay, if you haven't, you will before your life is over. No, you must. Benjamin Britten sets Wilfred Owen's World War I poems against the texts of the Mass for the Dead. With this juxtaposition, and it's only the surface of the musical rhetoric, complex, amazing rhetoric he uses throughout the whole of the Requiem. Those of you who are unacquainted with that Requiem for the Dead, a funeral rite, the funeral service, the classical sort of Western rite. The first performance of this piece was done in Coventry Cathedral, which some of you will remember, was done at the end of the Second War. The Allies had bombed Dresden, firebombed Dresden. The Germans had bombed Coventry Cathedral and ruined the ancient cathedral. The first performance was done within sight of the ruins of Coventry Cathedral. I want to focus in on one aspect of this Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, the Offertory. At the point of the Offertory, the music and the text together retell the biblical story of Abram and Isaac. So the narrator sings, "So Abram arose and clave the wood and went, and took Isaac with him and a knife." Well, you know the story. You're Baptist, you know the Bible. The boy observes the preparations for a sacrifice and asks where the lamb is. Where is the lamb for the offering? And the narrator sings, "Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. Notice already rhetorically he's building in preparation for the Wilfred Owen war poems, parapets and trenches. A musical shift then interposes, and the voice of a divine messenger, the angel, comes and sings to Abraham, "Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram. Offer the ram of pride instead of him," sings the text. The baritone and the tenor soloists are joined again by a children's choir. And those innocent trebles, here in your inner mind now, here in your imagination, a children's choir, their innocent voices, singing the ancient offertorium text from the Latin Mass. Osias et precis tibi Domini laudes offeremus, translated, sacrifice and prayers we offer, Lord, to you with praise, bring them from death to life. But unlike the biblical ending of the story, there follows a terrifying episode of words and music sung by the two soloists. But the old man would not so, and slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. The musical setting, that staccato setting of those two voices, with broken voices and broken musical form, singing one by one, is one of those extraordinary moments. No matter how often I hear it, it catches me off guard. Britain's musical intensification of this tension between the biblical account and the realities of war in our world becomes nearly unbearable. The phrase "one by one" is repeated in broken musical lines by the soloists, a kind of unspeakable contradiction to what the children are praying. A contradiction which only the music can convey because it's simultaneously holding together both. And only music does that. I select this moment in Britain's war requiem because it holds for me a clue to the artistic rendering of terror. It has echoed in my memory for decades since I first heard it, and it deepens with each subsequent performance. I have heard a number of live performances, and you could get wonderful recordings of this done by many great orchestras and soloists. Perhaps the most memorable one for me was with Maestro Robert Shaw, with whom I worked for several years in Atlanta. And I've come to regard this work as a kind of example of the larger concern that we live into in our world. How do we hold the beauty of it together with the terror, with the suffering? These words point to the extremities of suffering and our dwelling in this world. And in this case, could we say this, that Benjamin Britten's musical art fuses words and musical form to sound a complex beholding, a holding together of death and life. The poetry and the liturgical language, the language of the Latin Mass, are held together musically in ways that goes beyond what language itself can signify. Here I mean a gesture towards silence. The silence that comes when we are in the face of great suffering or terror. Footnote, my daughter Emily composed a piece called Deliverance. It was sung at Ground Zero in New York City. We write a little bit about this when we do she and I do some musical events together. We have these conversations about it. And she said she was in fear and trembling because you may remember once the buildings disappeared into dust, how awestruck we were, and how enraged we were, quite naturally so. Do something about this terrible violence. Well, they sang this piece, and in it is a line, with all the blood drying in the desert, can't we refresh the ground with something else? And she said at that moment, those people in New York City who had undergone that terror suddenly broke out into wild applause. That deep down underneath that, our basic human response is to say no to such violence. Music sometimes can say no to it, but it must pass honestly through it. So what I mean is that in Benjamin Britten's case, in this one instance at least, there's a kind of gesture towards silence, awestruck silence, silence before the mystery of what is it in this beautiful world that causes terror, but also in some sense sheds light on our living in the gap between the is of the world and the ought to be of it. I'll say that again, because I'm putting it in non-technical language. You, every one of you in this room, knows the gap between the is of the world and the ought to be of it. Or to use the old language of the spiritual, ain't what it's supposed to be. Not supposed to be that way. So silence that acknowledges the unspeakable in a way that both denies but permits access to the elemental facts of our life. The strangeness of this, of course, is that we're drawn to hear such a musical work again. You'll hear it again. Won't you? I will. Maybe not that work, but something else that has opened up for you the mystery of living at full stretch between the extremities. You'll hear it again. But a stranger mystery comes with the music. The more we listen, the more we become acquainted with the words and the musical forms, the more we hear, the more it illuminates. It deepens over time. Just like we do if we're attentive and wise. Novelist William Maxwell wrote a novel called Time Will Darken It, and I believe it. We keep returning to great works of art, B minor Mass, or whatever, name something that has come close to this gesture toward silence, that teaches us about this, and beholds it and holds it together as only music can. And you return to it knowing full well the words and the musical form. Of course, this could be said quite apart from our topic of extremity, couldn't it? You go back to those things, and don't they deepen? I'm struggling once again through Bach's partitas at the keyboard. I'm retired so I can practice again. Music, faculty, you know what I mean. Practicing again. And I'm discovering things in those partitas I never knew were there. Think of Glenn Gould. Young and rambunctious, strange and eccentric, playing the Goldberg variations when he was in his 20s. And then again, just a year or two before his life, playing them again. And we hear so much more. There, by the way, there is a recording that contains both his early playing of the Bach Goldberg and his late playing. Every student of music, at least if you're messing around with Bach, will do that. Now, let me give you another example, but very, very different. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard this, but again, I want to put it on your list of musical experiences and hence life experience, Gustav Mahler's Kindertotenlieder. This composition is about the death of children, not something any of us want, but some of us do have to face. He takes 5 of the poems of the German poet Northcutt and composes a 5-sectioned set of songs on this. He said to a friend, after he composed these, 1901, 1904, I placed myself, he said, in the situation that a child of mine had died. When I really lost my daughter, I could not have written those songs anymore. This is a very different and intimate relationship to personal suffering. Musically, I would love to have played all these things, but we could have been here for 5 hours, you know. When you listen to this, you understand that his musical vocabulary is very, very controlled. He uses a very small orchestration here. In fact, one of the best examples of the Kindertotenlieder is Fischer Dieskau singing with only an accompaniment on piano. It doesn't have the color of the orchestration, but there's something about the intensity and the way in which the piano, especially a Bösendorfer, can fade to silence. I can just give you some sense of this by reading out the titles of the 5 songs, the 5 portions. Kindertotenlieder, songs on the death of children. The first begins with this wonderful setting of, now the sun is about to rise as brightly as if the misfortune had not happened. Do you hear it already, just in that title? And when we listen and hear Mahler's musical interpretation of it, we feel our way into that tension, don't we? The sun is about to rise as if this misfortune hadn't happened. That's the first song. The second is, now I can see why such dark flames flashed for a moment from my eyes, as if into a single look to concentrate your whole power. That is to say, what happens when we take death in at a glance? The death of children. The third is, when thy dear mother comes through the door, and I turn my head and look toward her, my glance falls first not on her face, but on the place nearer the door where your dear little face would have been. Again, the restraint. If we were to listen to this, we would hear so much of this hovering very close to D. This third one, is the only one in D major. It does not rise and fall with great, great leaps. It stays very close and very informed. And there's something about the rhythm that keeps changing in this, the musical language, that speaks a kind of restless walking back and forth, trying to come to terms with this. Fourth, I often think that they have only gone out. Soon they will come home. And if any of you know Mahler's Ninth Symphony, he uses melodic lines here that when we hear the Ninth Symphony, recalls this. And not just the music, but recalls the text. You've had experiences like this, perhaps not quite as intense as this. But this is what the artistry of a great musician who understands enough of life can do. And finally, the fifth song. In this weather, in this raging, I never would have sent the children out. The poem implies that the children died of pneumonia or fever after exposure to the Theta, this weather. And then, at the climax of this fifth song, where you may say, all is lost, all is suffering, all is melancholy, all is sadness. there's the sound of the glockenspiel, a tiny ringing, in this case, a ringing in A major, against the D and the G major. And we heard the glockenspiel once before, in the opening song that signified the children's play. Now it returns and signifies something very different. But it also is the signification of the sunlight, the light that should return at the end of such a dark and deep journey into suffering. There is, near the end, a Mahlerian storm. It's only Gustav Mahler can paint a storm. This is not the storm of seas raging, Peter Grimes, Benjamin Britten, or name another sea storm that you know. This is the interior storm of regret, and perhaps just more than a little of, I wouldn't have let the children go out. These are all words, my friends. In the music, we get this. I wanted to open that work up for you because I think if you put that together with the notion of the cataclysms of ignorant armies that clash by night, and you see the intimate suffering of parents and lost children, then you see how it is that music is able to explore the extremities. So I recommend to you, especially those of you who may not know these works, to find ways to hear them. There really are exquisite recordings available of both. But best to hear it live, because there your body must respond. The sound of that glockenspiel. And if it should perchance that in your life you should hear a little child playing on a toy piano, again, after, you understand something more, don't you? Well, those are heavy words. I was going to say some words about Messiaen's Quartet from the End of Time, but perhaps we can talk about that tonight. But I'll say this. If you haven't heard that, put that on your list. That was composed in Stalag 8. That was composed in a Nazi camp for 4 musicians. Messiaen, the great organist, French organist and composer, composed this quartet for the End of Time for 4 instruments. Perhaps we can find a recording of it and play it tonight. But now let's turn our attention to something closer to us, who darken doors of churches and sing familiar hymns. Before I go to my 2 examples, I call upon your memory. I call upon your memory to hear again in your mind the tune of a familiar hymn. How about this? Cliched as hymns like What Wondrous Love or Amazing Grace have become, they have encoded for you, even if you're young, layers of experience. And take seriously what music does by way of accumulating experience and giving it back to us long after, on the far side of musical sophistication. We'll come back to that point, okay? Hold that point. Hold it. Because you all have access to this. Every one of us. Even if you're tone deaf. Perhaps even better if you're tone deaf. Here is an example of a 20th century hymn writer, two hymn text writers, one man, one woman, who within the constraints of strophic hymns. Harry Askew was here last year. You know all about hymns now, forever and ever, because Harry was here. Brian Wren, the title of the text, or the hymn text, is When Pain and Terror Strike by Chance. Now, we're familiar, many of us, with the text of Brian Wren, and they appear in every major denominational hymnal. He draws these wonderful things out of biblical imagery, narratives, but also fuses them with real-life experiences. And he's advanced and deepened our sung theology since the late 1960s. One of his hymns, written 15 years ago, that is before 9/11, for example, suddenly became stunningly and unexpectedly relevant. Having been involved with worship services during those tumultuous days where people came to our churches wondering what to do, what to say, I discovered this hymn and used it in several contexts. And persons who sang the words said things like, "We found it very hard to sing, but it sounded the truth we needed to hear." Here's the opening stanza. When pain and terror strike by chance, with causes unexplained, when God seems absent or asleep and evil unrestrained, we crave an all-controlling force ready to rule and warn, but find, far shadowed by a cross, a child in weakness born. You feel this tensive pull in the words? The first three lines take the startling open phrase and draw out spiritual implications. The final two lines set up a tensive response of faith. In this case, the Christian theological claim of death and birth, of incarnation, the weakness of a child born. The remaining stanzas of Wren's hymn unfold the tensions that lie beneath the surface of that response. That is to say, we find far shadowed by a cross, a child in weakness born. Listen to the second stanza. We marvel at God's nakedness and sense the play of chance in Herod's anger, Peter's growth, and Pilate's troubled glance. Our Savior's tempted, tested way was never cut and dried, but costly, risking life and love, betrayed and crucified. So you see what he's doing? He's taking that tension and now expanding it and drawing into its orbit other images, other scriptural images, so we begin to understand something about them as they are related to the one whose life we sing. The next stanza sings of the weakness of God's wisdom, which risks, but also, quote, shreds the shroud of death and fate, freeing our hearts for good. So we breathe the ample air of hope and take our chance with God. This is not exactly, your grandmother's soothing hymn text. This takes us to places in these tensive lines that bring to mind more of Scripture and more of life than we had counted on. The words sung take on other ranges of overtone, depending, of course, on the musical setting, and that's part of my point. So I want to illustrate here. It is often set to the tune King's Fold, that some of you may know. It's an old English and Irish melody collected by Lucy Broadbent in the 19th century and arranged by Ralph Vaughan Williams. It's E minor, of course, and the sweep of the melody give a kind of space to the text. And you'll hear it. I'm going to play it for you first. You'll recognize the tune. A, B, A. Give it coherence with alternating harmonic settings. But just this coherence heightens the tensions between the images of pain and perplexity and the claims of faith. So let me bring that to you. So if I played another musical setting, there might be yet something else. I love that notion that Christ should come and hold us fast when faith and hope are torn. I can imagine setting that to an even wilder tune. I can imagine setting that text, for example, to, and it would change, wouldn't it, if we did this to it. Deepen and signify ranges of things so far as they fuse with musical settings like that. That was my tune, so toss it off. One more hymn text. Good. One more hymn text, just to illustrate and to get you to go on for yourselves. To get you to do this, to sense this, too. Here is Sylvia Dunstan, who died way, way, way too young. A Canadian woman. A tune called Christus Paradox. This now takes the tension straight into theology. The D minor key has a sense of mystery about it. I'll play it for you in a little bit, especially in the rising and opening notes and dying away sense of the final phrase. And it sets up this remarkable tension. And here is an example of a text that goes into theology and into the images of Scripture and does this same quality of holding together the things that often fall apart and that we rush over. Her life was way, way too brief, but here's an Advent hymn in which an extended prayer is addressed to the God-man, the one who, as the first stanza sings, is both our lamb and shepherd, both prince and slave, both priest, peacemaker, and sword-bringer, the one whom we both scorn and crave. Again, this is not your Sunday school song. In this text there is embedded a kind of recurring phrase around which all the tensions for me orbit. The phrase is, you, the everlasting instant. One might paraphrase this as eternal now, or eternity breaking into time, or the temporal moment that bears all time in reality. You, the everlasting instant, worthy of the Kierkegaard, I should say. The tune to which this text is wedded is from a 17th century French folk tune, best known to us as Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, from the 4th century liturgy of St. James. So already the tune comes with its own history of having set a text of mystery. So we might talk about the archaeology of music that this melody brings with all its other associations. In this case, the mystery of a very high Christology to the worship of heavenly things. 6-winged seraphs, cherubim with sleepless eye, veil their faces to the presence. Do you know this hymn? Do you know this hymn? Actually, it's in this hymnal. It's right here at 80, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. Juxtaposing, of putting together the high and the low aspects of who this incarnate one is. Listen to this. Clothed in light upon the mountain, stripped of might upon the cross, shining in eternal glory, beggared by a soldier's toss. You, the everlasting instant, you who are both gift and cost. And then the third stanza, you walk each day beside us, sit in dark outside. You preach a way that's narrow, have a love that reaches wide. You the everlasting instant, you our pilgrim guide. Something about that near plain song melody with its rising and falling that captures this. And when the acclamation finally breaks out, it bursts out in the last stanza, it's reminiscent of the songs in the book of Revelation. Handel was inspired by these, of course, but continues to hold the tensions. Worthy is our earthly Jesus, worthy is our cosmic Christ, worthy your defeat and victory, worthy still your peace and strife. You the everlasting instant, you who are our death and life. Sylvia Dunstan. Choral settings have been made of this. I hope some of you may find them. I've used them. One by Alfred Fedax, quite lovely, takes that last phrase and makes it into an antiphon for everyone to sing. Alleluia, alleluia, you who are our death and life. And in this way, the congregation, the choir, the musicians come together to offer this paradoxical praise to the one who is paradoxically the giver and the inspiration of all song. Time would fail us, but let me mention just a couple of things more. We're in Lent, for those of you who practice such a thing. And the spirituals come to mind, don't they? And why are the spirituals so deep? It's because they encode the life of suffering. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long way from home. If you haven't, you will. This is part of the extremity of life. Close to life. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Music and words together that ask a question that is surrounded by the silence that beholds the mystery which is sung, which is spoken. Well, let's go back to our 4 proposals and see if they've made any sense to you now that we've come this far through these examples. And of course, I implied by this lecture that I cannot finish this lecture. You must, and you will, if you're a musician at all, and if you go to a church, or if you go to concert halls where they offer something other than 1-4-5-1 chord patterns. But that's another lecture. Sorry. Now, let's go back to those 4 and see. Let's pull them through and see if they make more sense to you now than when we first began. Music is intimately related to the narrative quality, our patterning through time. Because life now, has to be said, has pitch and tone and rhythm and tempo and passage and disharmony and harmony, does it not? Second, music, when the texts and the musical form are wedded well, there's the rub. Music adds a kind of element of inexpressibility to the expressible. Holds together things that we can't quite say. Does that make a little more sense to you now? Haven't you been, since a lot of you are church folk, haven't you been in church and you say, I don't know whether I can believe that until you sing it. Or you're in the grip of grief. You've lost something precious to yourself and you can't sing except in croaked voices. And someone around you sings for all the saints who from their labors rest, or whatever you wish to say. Hasn't that happened to you? It has, or it will. That element of holding together and providing for us a way of coming to terms with extremity. Third, some music has that capacity to deepen our understanding by accumulating levels of awareness. Sometimes you'll hear a voice, and it will remind you of a voice of someone you have lost. And it comes flooding back. The sound of a voice, the sound of a bell, the sound of a glockenspiel. Fourth, music, and especially singing together in worship context, can become a gathering. I called it an eschatological art. That's a fancy seminary word. What it means is that it somehow gathers our past and our future into this present encounter. It promises more than we know. Opens a way. Well, I hope this very brief excursus into 2 concerted works, with the hints of some more, and 2 hymn texts, and you can supply your own, gives you some sense of that. Then well beyond and wildly beyond what we've said here, lay things like John Adams' Migration of Souls, or Penderecki's Threnody, or other works. Or yes, even Charles Ives. Hearing the band playing in one corner and the old gospel songs sung in another, and usually sung in 2 different keys. Charles Ives. Worth getting to know. Really interesting American composer. Okay, one more note must be sounded. When all is said and done about the great works of music, and when we have concluded that even modest compositions such as hymns or psalm settings have the power to touch and speak to suffering and to beauty, There are also our everyday encounters, the surprising and mysterious being affected when a single phrase or a sound of a human voice falls upon us with unexpected pathos and power. As T.S. Eliot once observed, music heard so deeply that you are the music while the music lasts. Here I simply remind us of how close to the pitch and rhythm of life itself small fragments of music can come. The evocation of a sense of life, so much encoded in sound, so much taken in by the body memory of moments ordinary, yet bearing poignancy, and a wide range of our being, affected by one another in this world, and our struggle to believe before God. And that the ear can see and move and taste and sing is a mystery. Is it any wonder then that we often have the experience of coming to understand something inexpressible in the language, and perhaps even unbearable in the language of music? And so I end this way. Beauty can deceive, and terror can drive us to despair, unrelieved, and self-torture. But where our lives, in time and space, are receptive to mystery and suffering encoded through music, we come to that juncture of what we know and don't know, to the glory and the fragility of this embodied life as part of the whole created order of things. And in the midst of the terror and the beauty, we dare the poetics of prayer and song and worship, speaking the name of the unspeakable reality of God in praise, in lament and joy. Doxology without lament can be a snare and a delusion. Enough of ultra-bright Christianity. Unrelieved. We can talk about that if that offends. But practices that form us in a sense of the world that can hold together the suffering and the joy are more fitting than is a sense of the world that ignores the suffering or that coldly assesses the brute facts apart from any whelming of human subjectivity. When faith, then, can speak truthfully about joy in the midst of tribulation, we pause. When practices make palpable over time how we are to live and open up our lives to the full stretch of our humanity in this life, then we should be filled with awe and wonder. Ah, the music everywhere. And then we come back to music in all of its forms and search for those clues that I've tried to suggest in very fragmentary ways. This is to grasp, but if through a glass darkly, the hope of which Revelation speaks. Thank you.